Thank you, Hanis. Hello, everyone. The speaker who will take the microphone shortly is someone who is dear to us in Yayasan Hasanah. As the founding director of Yayasan Hasanah, Tan Sri Azman Haji Mokhtar is responsible in founding many notable institutions and practices, including Yayasan Khazanah Research Institute, the Khazanah Megatrends Forum, the Trust School Program, Kembara Khazanah, Ting City, Amanah Warisan Negara, and Taman Tugu Park. Tan Sri Azman was the Managing Director of Khazanah Nasional Berhad from June 2004 to July 2018. Upon retirement from Khazanah, he has been active in various public service, academic and commercial institutions. Among his current and recent affiliations include as the Chairman of the Board of Directors of University Technology Malaysia, UTM, Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Centre of Development Studies, University of Cambridge, Bi-Fellow of Darwin College, University of Cambridge, an adjunct professor at UTM, a board member of INSIF, the International Centre for Education in Islamic Finance in Malaysia, and a trustee of the Wawasan Education Foundation in Penang. His research interest is in the area of finance and its impact on society. In January and April 2021, respectively, he was appointed by the Prime Minister of Malaysia to 2 high-level national councils chaired by the PM, namely as the member of the Majlis Kemakmuran Bumiputra Prosperity Council, and a member of the Majlis Tindakan Kemakmuran Bersama, Shared Prosperity Action Council. Tan Sri Azman is also a board member of Mercy Malaysia, a leading international humanitarian relief organisation headquartered in Kuala Lumpur. Tan Sri Azman is also a member of various international affiliations, such as VB Asset Management LLC, Fitrah Capital Associates, among others. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now kindly invite Tan Sri Azman to deliver the special address From Charity to Justice. Dipersilakan.
Thank you very much, Intan. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And very good afternoon to all of you. First of all, big thanks to the organizers, Yayasan Hasanah, for this very special invitation. As a founding director, YH is of course very dear and close to me, as it is indeed to Tan Sri Matno and to Dato Shahira and to the many of you here and elsewhere who have played a part in its setup some 6 or 7 years ago, but also to the many more who were there before it was born. For many months, even years, we were planning, dreaming, working, praying for its conception. Alhamdulillah, Shahira and Tan Sri Chief, I have followed with much pride of the progress that has been made by YH, and I think clearly and significantly over this COVID period, indeed your journey continues to come into its own, and today is a major milestone. Indeed, our journey, as you know, was one of a collective undertaking at Khazanah during the time I was there for 14 years. Quite early on, I think we made a decision that we felt it was important to not just create value, but to build what we call true value, but importantly to also do it by building through values. So on this auspicious occasion, if I can take a little bit of time to highlight an anecdote I always wanted to share about YH, but perhaps never had a chance to. It is about how Hasanah got its name, and there is a significance to that. And I would like to honor our former colleague, the late Arwah Ismail Faris Ali, as the person who named Hasanah, and the one that I think I had the pivotal discussion with him that led to the formation of YH. So on a day like this, I thought it's important I share this bit of history so that you know where you're coming from on your journey as you move along. So this would have been more than 12 years ago as Arwah Ismail Faris passed away on Christmas Eve, 2009. So that's almost 12 years ago. In our discussion, we concluded that Khazanah, which is not just at the juncture between state and markets, but more critically is as a kind of a fulcrum in the task of national development that we had to deliver not just financial returns, but also to uplift national competitiveness and shape at the same time a more inclusive and equitable society. This is of course a very heavy inclusive mandate that we, as I mentioned, eventually translated into this concept of true value, which means to deliver financial, economic, and societal value. So in my discussions with many colleagues, but in particular, I remember Arwah Ismail Faris, we could not resist the wordplay between the notion of delivering economic and financial value, that means the Khazanah part, and also doing good, which is the Hasanah part. And hence, Yayasan Hasanah was born, and hopefully it was a near immaculate conception, because I can tell you now that that conversation actually happened in no less than the holy city of Mecca itself. Perhaps this acts as a prayer born in the name that inshallah, we pray that you will continue to be a vehicle for doing good and for a long time to come. Ladies and gentlemen, when I first accepted the invitation to speak several months ago, I should have been more careful to note that the topic given to me, from charity to justice, is actually a pretty heavy and philosophical one. But I must say, Dato Shahira got me to do some good though, because it forced me to read and research books and relevant texts in trying to go deeper into this topic and to do justice to it, I hope. I should therefore add a disclaimer that the topic that I would like to go through today should read From Charity to Justice, the Role of Business and Finance, a Practitioner's Perspective, as this is what I believe I am more qualified to speak on. So in the limited time available, I will try to cover this in three parts. First, necessarily, I need to go through a little bit my basic understanding of the theoretical framework very quickly. Second, then I would like to move to the realm of practice and to try to highlight 5 principles of translating that theory into practice, or moving from charity to justice, in particular from the standpoint of business and finance. And finally, and most importantly perhaps, is to land on 5 proposed calls to action, because that is in the end what I think really matters, not just knowledge, but applied knowledge. So first, I must say, from the overarching theory, and I suppose taxonomy is the word, from charity to justice, I spent the last few months pondering over why is it YH has chosen this rather curious notion of moving from charity to justice, as in moving from being merely and suboptimally just doing charity to something greater and better. I must admit, in my rather simplistic conception of things, I always thought that in that charity and its qualities of being part of a bigger thing called mercy, for example, rahmah, and love is surely of a higher order than just justice per se, which under some conceptions, justice can be rather cold and legalistic, a narrow form of justice. I note that the quote by Abraham Lincoln, for example, who said, "I have always found that mercy bears richer fruits than just strict justice." Or you may have seen, like me, you may have seen this gentleman, a rather folksy guy by the name of Honorable Frank Caprio. He's the Chief Judge of the Municipal Court of Providence, Rhode Island. He's a bit of a YouTube and WhatsApp star. You may have seen this. He would always defy legal convention to deliver not just justice according to the law, but more importantly, he has the grace, the empathy, the charity and mercy of delivering true justice. If you Google this, Frank Caprio, not Leonardo DiCaprio, Frank Caprio is his name. But perhaps most of all, I ask, and I'm guided, that we often hear the exhortation, the instruction from the Holy Quran in Surah An-Nahl, the 16th chapter, the 90th verse. Bear with me, where Allah Ta'ala says, "Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan." Allah commands justice and kindness. And the verse goes on to say, giving to kinsfolk and forbids all that is shameful and injustice and wickedness, that he instructs you in order that you may take heed. So this term, adil wal ihsan, now even with my poor tajweed, this sounds somewhat familiar, is because this particular verse is always read at the very close of every Friday khutbah or sermon everywhere in the world, and it's been going on non-stop for the last 1,400 years. So imagine, of all the verses, this is the verse that we are instructed to apply not just adil, justice, but also ihsan, which is kindness, as the first clear instruction. And secondly, a clear admonishment of the bad stuff, the shameful, the injustices, the wicked, and indeed the corrupt. Those, ladies and gentlemen, are our clear instructions. So when I further read the concept note and discussing with Dato Shahira and her excellent team, I, however, understood the origin of the theme from charity to justice, which is actually a reflection of the current debate and controversy, especially in the United States during this so-called new Gilded Age, where philanthropy, as we have heard this morning by various speakers, is seen as, in many circles as a bit of a fig leaf, a PR exercise, or even a tax dodge to avoid from doing the really meaningful stuff of, I suppose, approximating justice. So while this may be a slight caricature and a little bit extreme, because there are many good, effective, sincere, and thoughtful philanthropes, this raging controversy, the fact that it is an issue, the need to move from generosity to justice, and indeed the current controversy around greenwashing in the ESG and SDG movement does reflect why this is relevant today. So I hope that settles it somewhat, in that what we mean by moving from charity to justice, if I could restate that, at least for my own purpose and of thinking, is that we need to move from a kind of false charity or greenwashing to a more proper form of real justice, and even better, as instructed, to move into the realm of real ihsan, or kindness and mercy. A second macro point I need to quickly run through is to answer this age-old, ideologically loaded question as to what exactly is justice. This term justice is, of course, contested since time immemorial and will be so for a very long time. Amartya Sen, the famous economist and philosopher and Nobel laureate, famously outlines in his parable of the flute as to which child should have the flute. Is it Clara who made the flute? Is it Anne who plays the flute beautifully? Or is it poor Bob, the one who has no toys and has nothing to play with? The answer, of course, depends on your own worldview. But these are not just philosophical mind games, ladies and gentlemen, because there is indeed a reasonable consensus as to what is a sense of natural justice that is in our natural sense of fitrah. In fact, a famous scientific experiment has shown that even apes and chimpanzees understand this fitrah. In a famous experiment, as you know, when the distribution of bananas is unfair, you will get the apes and chimpanzees testing. So which means to say this world is indeed built on a certain balance, on a certain fairness and justice. And this is what the world lives on. So ladies and gentlemen, then there are, of course, the practitioners who will take this philosopher's paradox, if you like, and try to solve it in practical terms. A technologist, for example, from among us may decide to open up an Uber for flutes. It's not such a silly idea. There's already an Uber for many things, for handbags, for example, I'm told, for cars. Or give it to the financiers who will find a way to slice and dice this by creating a financial instrument for fractional ownership of the flute, or to fund Anne on her projected future cash flows, or to lend to Bob on the basis of his income from other revenue streams. And we can ask also, what about the other practitioners on whom much power is vested on to do this? This is the politicians. Well, they may well form a yayasan, for example. Not this yayasan, but it could be another yayasan. But then again, an astute And perhaps an adil and ihsan statesman could, of course, do some clever social engineering by creating music academies for the poor or lending libraries involving musical instruments donated by rich kids with no talent, or inclination to play music. You get the point, ladies and gentlemen, that this theoretical and philosophical point, interesting as it is, but let me try to outline 5 principles that I think are important in order to reach what I would like to propose as 5 action points. The first principle I would like to highlight is, again, what is adil? I think we have to define this. As mentioned, this is contested, but for me, a simple but satisfying definition is the one mentioned by our own Professor Said Naqib Al-Atas, who succinctly says that, I quote, "Justice is a state of being, a condition of things being in their proper place." What that means that putting things in their right place, in the right proportion, at the right time, is the act of being just. That sounds deceptively simple, but of course, as we know, we have then to know what is the proper place, what is the proper proportion, and what is the proper time in the first place. But that's where it's a long story, among others, understanding knowledge and ultimately wisdom comes in. But you can see how this elegant definition is helpful, it's easy to grasp, and indeed is a challenge that we all can spend the rest of our lives trying to actualize. The second principle is that removing a harm or injustice is better than doing a good or promoting justice per se. There is an inherent wisdom in the saying that first, do no harm, and then do some good. Indeed, the wise Malay proverb even goes further and better by saying that buat baik berpada-pada, buat jahat jangan sekali. That is to say, to do good, even to do good in moderation, but never ever do the bad things. In Amartya Sen's magisterial work, The Idea of Justice, he too actually, in synthesizing Eastern and Western thought traditions, he highlighted the merit of removing injustice over merely doing good. And indeed, in Islamic jurisprudence, as many of you know in fiqh, this is a well-established principle. And the third principle is the role of business or finance in a stakeholder economy and not just a shareholder economy. Back in 2004, it was a rather lonely journey when we went out on a limb at Hasana to say that the role of a business is actually to serve society, while of course making sure that we make sufficient and proper risk-adjusted returns. This was not the conventional view at that time when shareholder value was really the dominant economic and financial philosophy. In that regard, today, this is now mainstream, as you know. It is not just mainstream, it has gathered a lot of pace. And in that regard, the resulting practice of delivering all of this financial and economic through impact, responsible investing, through Khazanah as a sovereign development fund and not just as a sovereign wealth fund, as well as societal value creation, we heard about all the institutions that have been created, was part of this thinking, actually, of this principle. The fourth principle, since the concept note of YH talks about nation building, we heard about Negara Makmur Sejahtera and how to actualize justice. These are very tough questions. Every country is now grappling with this. The climate crisis, the inequality gaps, the refugee and migration crisis, and the increase in frequency and amplitude of financial health crisis are just some of the symptoms of this. In China, they talk about common prosperity. In Glasgow last week, it was about trying to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And in Malaysia, we speak of shared prosperity. We don't have time to do the proper justice to this, but a really useful framework that I kind of stumbled upon actually 20 years ago as I completed my master's degree in development. I've been pondering about this for more than 20 years actually now. And I must say this has influenced a lot of my work at Khazanah and beyond. And this is Ibn Khaldoon's Circle of Equity. So as you know, Ibn Khaldoon's seminal work, the Muqaddimah, was published in 1377, that's more than 600 years ago, and has been rightly recognized by both Western scholars such as Gibbon, Toynbee, probably Adam Smith as well, and as well as Muslim scholars and even Mark Zuckerberg, interestingly, to have extraordinary insights into how justice is both an end and a means to it being actualized. So if you allow me a few minutes just to run through very quickly the 8 points on the circle of equity. The first one, the strength of the sovereign depends on the implementation of the rule of law. The second point, the rule of law cannot be implemented except by a sovereign. The third point, the sovereign cannot gain strength except through the people, the rakyat. The fourth point, the people, the rakyat, cannot be sustained without wealth. The fifth point, wealth cannot be acquired except through development. You need to push those boundaries. Number 6, development cannot be attained except through justice. And number 7, justice, ladies and gentlemen, is the criterion by which God will evaluate mankind. And number 8, the sovereign is charged with the responsibility of actualizing justice. The Circle of Equity from Muqaddimah was highlighted in a brilliant book called The Future of Economics and Islamic Perspective by Dr. Umar Chapra, a prominent Islamic economist whom I read in the summer of the year 2000, and 2001 rather. And finally, the fifth principle is beware of the law of unintended consequences. Now, even as we overcome all of this, we need to recall the definition of adil is that we need to do things properly to put things in the right place. In this regard, while businesses and finance must do no harm and indeed serve a broader stakeholder economy, it must not lose sight of its first fiduciary role of delivering good, reasonable, and properly earned risk-adjusted return. For the not-for-profits and CSOs, including YH, must also internalize, in my view, further not just its tremendous potential and ability to mobilize for good as you are doing, but it must also know its limits and not suffer the classic trap of overreach. In short, we need to think and do horses for causes as part of doing justice in the fullest sense of the word. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to close by, here are 5 things that I think we can do, and some we're already doing. If so, that's good, let's do it better. If not, let's start this now, tomorrow, and together. The first one, if we believe in that principle, then we must do our best, hard as it may, that we need to, before we do good, we need to think and ask, what are the biggest obstacles in our society that we need to fight harm and remove evil, or what is known as nahi munkar, as you know. Now, the parable is, of course, that imagine that all the good we do in desperately trying to paddle a sinking boat or furiously trying to throw out the seawater is quite futile if we don't patch up the holes in our vessel, let alone allow new gaping holes to be created. We must fight corruption. We must fight mismanagement. We must fight the abuse of power. We must fight bigotry. I know it's not easy, but wherever little effort or big effort or medium-sized effort we can do, we must. It all counts. And we should do it in a jama'ah. We never ever concede that it's Tina. You know what is Tina? There is no alternative. This is a saying by Margaret Thatcher. There is always an alternative. Getting sacked or resigning, for example, is an alternative. My friend and colleague Tan Sri Nazir Razak, I note, will present his views on the national reset tomorrow, so I won't venture there further. I was indeed honored to proofread his book and to contribute to the Better Malaysia project, and I agree in principle with Nazir's prognosis of the three-headed monster, Raksasa Kepala Tiga. I think this is what you will hear about tomorrow. The second point is really around doing good. And here briefly, I think the 5 transitions that we need to think of are around moving business to truly operate in a stakeholder economy, not merely a shareholder economy. To move finance from being served by the real economy and society to the reverse, to reclaim its proper place. and to move Islamic finance in particular from being merely a form of halal or permissible, a narrow permissibility, to being of substance and spirit of not just halal but tayyib, i.e. wholesome and closer to really the principles of the Sharia. To move philanthropy and the NFP, not-for-profit sector, from being, as we heard, from just the fig leaf of false charity to a more authentic and strategic and catalytic form of giving, of removing pain points and truly promoting good. For the civil service to perhaps move the civil service to be more civil and to be more of service. And for politics, which ought to be the most noble of arts, rather than otherwise, to move politics from a rakus type of politics to a more inspired form of statesmanship and inclusive democracy that incidentally we should remember for large parts of our 64-year national history, we actually had some semblance of that. Business and finance practices, there are many, and as I mentioned, from ESG, SDG, impact investing, green sukuk, digital, inclusive banking, the Perkukuh plan, and so on. Unlike 15 years ago, when it was quite lonely, this is now mainstream. So please seize the day. The last 2 points really around, first of all, institutions, which is about the power of longevity and the power of collective action. No one ever said doing this is going to be easy. In fact, it's very hard. It's dangerous even. Apart from doing this collectively, if we want a vision of a more equitable and just society, we need to think about how can we make this to be more lasting. Our mantra at Hasanah then, when I was running it, was very much performance-based, among other things. And we had our tagline, for example, of executelah kamu sebelum kamu diexecutekan, if you may recall. It was about performance. And indeed, performance and delivery culture is still super important. But we must also now work towards building institutions. Why are institutions important? Because they are bulwarks and insurance plans against arbitrariness, against the tides and cycles of power shifts, against our own mortality, and indeed against our own petty vanities. Ladies and gentlemen, therefore, we need to add to that earlier mantra by saying that we must institutionalize lah sebelum kamu diinstitutionalizekan. You can go crazy running this if you're not careful. So please institutionalize, as indeed YH and others are doing. And finally, the power of personal agency. I would like to end with a reminder to myself and to all of us, and a call to action that charity indeed begins at home, my home and your home. As Mahatma Gandhi said, that we must try to be the change that we wish to see in this world. A week ago, I was privileged to speak at a COP26 panel on ethical finance at the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow. It was an opportunity to be reminded that the great economist was first of all the professor of moral philosophy at the university from 1752 to 1764. And indeed, his lectures on ethics eventually became the core of his first great work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Smith had always intended that his most famous work, The Wealth of Nations, was actually to be located within an ethical and moral economy. This is, of course, often ignored today or neglected. As the session that I attended and spoke at was also a gathering of faith-based finance, and I was representing Islamic finance, I took the opportunity to talk about not just reclaiming the moral economy of Adam Smith, as we must, in the aim of building a more just society, but indeed we must go all the way back to not just Adam Smith, but to Adam himself, as our common forefather, to reclaim the eternal message of humanity. Indeed, the message of all the prophets from Adam alayhi salam to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Abrahamic faith, and indeed through the teachings of the Dharmic religions and the Taoist and Confucian traditions, at its heart is a clear and beautiful message of charity, kindness, grace, justice, and ultimately mercy. And it is on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you once again. and with a call that we must do what we can, and we must do it together. Thank you very much.